Hey, what's going on, guys? It's me, Train Man, and welcome back to the Zombie Train, episode 200 and something. Let me see. Episode 200, whatever, Building a Mountain. Episode 206. This is... Oh, we have an interesting question on this one, and frankly, one of them is a... Well, it's sort of a double, and it's what became of two separate engines. But first, I'm going to cover what we're doing today, and basically, like I said, we're building a mountain. This is the... Basically, I have to build this as a backdrop. It's not functional yet, and it won't be for some time, more than likely. But I do have to build this as a backdrop, so the scenery doesn't just disappear at the back end of a shot. This is Honor Peak. It is a mountain which a cog railway climbs, and will probably be featured in some Iron Horseman plots in the future. But anyways, let me grab the source for this question. So this was in episode 190. Zombie Train. Oops, that's not how you spell that. 190. Aha, it was the episode Running Out of Engines. Okay. 261 and E75. So Milwaukee Road 261 and Milwaukee Road E75. Now let me refresh my memory on what those are. 261. I do recall 261. Yeah, kind of a hefty engine. So Milwaukee Road 261, for those who are not aware, is a northern, which was, I believe, functional in yeah, it was functional when the Great Panic happened. On September 29th, 2012, 261 was fired and ran for the first time in 4 years or so. And this engine, when we got a hold of her, obviously it was some time later. It was a few years after that. And it's holed up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Yes? And this is, oh no, based in Minneapolis. Okay, it's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, this engine didn't go too far from where it started. When we got a hold of her, because she was runnable, we basically ran her out of that location. Or, well, we ran her out of a location close to Minneapolis. Obviously, Minneapolis, being a fairly large city, was not the kind of thing where you wanted to leave it there. So, we sort of built her a makeshift shed outside, and used her to shore up some of the passes initially. Now, the reason she was such a heavily used locomotive to begin with was because she was operational. We didn't have to put a lot of effort into getting the engine running because, frankly, all you really had to do was put some grease on the bearings and, do some basic... it had been sitting for a little while, but, scrape the rust off, put a little paint on it, put, heapings of grease, make sure everything sort of flexes well, make sure all the bearings are in good order, put a fire in it, and get moving. And that all took place within the course of about a week, which was a really, really tough week, I'm going to be honest. So, this was something I was there for. This was early on in... This was rather early on in the Zombie Train Incorporated, because we realized we needed more power. Obviously, we knew that. But we needed to rebuild some of what had been lost in terms of mountain passes. And the first and foremost was Mariah's Pass, having suffered significant damage. And even though we had managed to get across it in the Zombie Train prior, it wasn't passable once again. It was damaged when we got to it, and it was damaged further once we had crossed it, really. But it had gotten significantly worse due to outside intervention, shall we say, between us crossing it and when the Zombie Train Incorporated started. So, this engine was in a perfect position to run supply runs to the east side of Marias Pass. And that's what it did. That's what it did early on, and then later it became a runner over Marias Pass. Now, it certainly had the capability to go much further, but because of the lack of engines that we had initially, and we still faced power shortages late into the days until we got the diesels back, you needed to be able to count on engines being places. And so the routes that engines ran and the distances that they covered were kind of segmented, and they were kind of I suppose the word would be sectionalized, in that you'd never have certain engines leaving certain bounds, and the train would always be handed off there. And this was done in a very regimented fashion, and it may not have been hugely efficient, but resources were something we had, and engines were something we did not have, and it was worth far more to always have an engine on standby in case of whatever. Be that, a fairly large attack that the standing garrison could not repel, of zombies, of people, or, something like a breakout of a disease, or even just one individual being, terribly sick, and they need to get to some place with better medical care, etc. You always wanted to have an engine on standby somewhere, and I talked about having the O4Os as kind of, shuttle engines, or, a lot of the smaller engines doing that sort of duty when there was not another engine present. And this was true because we had a lot of country and not a lot of engines, and we had 200 O4Os at the beginning, or, once we got everything, before we started building our own. And this engine served most of the east side of Marias Pass. And then as time went on, when they made the connection once again and Marias Pass was completed, it shared Marias Pass. So, it still never went too far from its homeland. Every once in a long while you'd see it get called out somewhere east or somewhere south. But for the most part, it stayed up there. It was a fairly decent engine. Now, the other one, however, MILW E75. Now, I can already tell you that E75 was not something that we desired to get our hands on. E75, for those who don't know, is an electric locomotive. It's an EF4. It's a little Joe. And of all the things that we were striving for to get operating, to get rebuilt, electric systems were not high on the priority list. Power grids were, because having enough power to run cities means that you have enough power to run defenses, or at the very least spotlights and things like that. Spotlights aren't too hugely intensive, but having good lighted coverage is really kind of important if you're searching for, zombies approaching you in the darkness. They will be attracted to light, but they aren't the brightest, so you can just basically build a moat and they'll fall in most of the time. But anyways, having power is important for more than just defenses. Now, in a few rare cases, it was important for rail lines. In places where we had pre-existing electrified corridors, for example, the Northeast Corridor, getting operational small segments of it did prove to be useful in the long run. We had it took some doing, but via the use of power plants that we could get a hold of, we managed to get the section between New Haven and Providence operational, which was very, very useful. Quonset being not too far off from that. It's on that segment. So, that being our big changeover point, or that being our home base, more or less, it meant that we didn't have to worry about a lot of resources coming in to operate locomotives there. But it also meant that if we did have resources coming in there, we didn't have to expend more resources to get them distributed. Now, Quonset is a deep water port. It's a very useful place to bring resources in if they're coming in by ship, which we did have plenty of. Because, honest to goodness, ships trains are second only in efficiency in moving things to, bulk cargo ships and barges. The trade-off is, of course, they go slow. But this wasn't much of a matter, and when we could get stuff moved by ship, and, setting up the infrastructure for that is not a piece of cake, but where we could get a hold of it, we made use of it as best we could. And so we had a few ports that were out of the way of populous areas, which is sort of surprising on its own, because generally you see populous areas spring up around ports. So these were newer constructions that were built outside of cities on purpose. And once we got these, our own makeshift shipping lanes up and operational, then we had multiple forms of communication, or multiple forms of transportation, sorry. We didn't put as much stress on our coastal rail lines, and thus on our engines and our dispatchers as well. It was actually pretty handy to have these, to have those shipping lanes. But, to get back to the discussion on E75, the Milwaukee Road electrics are quite different, and same thing with the Pennsy electrics. They're different than what we have today. And there's a reason that antique electric locomotives do not run these days, for the most part. And part of it is, it's the way they're constructed, it's the way the transformers work on the inside, and you can look up stuff like that. They're, a lot of the older ones, the GG ones especially come to mind. I don't remember what it is, but it's basically, there's some sort of very toxic liquid or gas in there that was used to cool them or something like that. I would need to go and do more research on this, but I read about it at one point, a period in time ago. But, E75 and other vintage electrics were not something we had any interest in, because they provided no advantages over modern electrics which we could get our hands on. And, like I was saying about the corridor between New Haven and Quonset, along with another couple of stretches, we mostly used toasters, the AEM7s, partly because the HHP8s are kind of unreliable. And obviously the ACS-54s were never going to come. Also, Acellas would have been kind of unwieldy. So, yeah, we made use of our toasters. So we had toasters and steam engines running in tandems with which is funny that I talk about the handoff was at New Haven, because way back in the day the handoff used to be at New Haven from steam to electric, except it was the other way around. Steam to the east towards Boston. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week. Train man out.